In the name of the one and only, we are beginning this session with another discussion that has to do with peace and war, and I would like to discuss it more from the negation of peace, the concept of warrior culture versus the culture of war. Traditionally, the belief is that there is a warrior culture concept that many societies now and in the past have been sort of dedicated, or perhaps more correctly immersed into the concept of war through the language, the vocabulary, the heroism, valor, power, and all the idealized ways in which war is promoted. And therefore, the heroes of many cultures have been warriors. And so war becomes the main theme and the main concept and the main persuasion of a society. And obviously the warriors do become the heroes, and not too many sheroes there, but the heroes then kind of define the idea and ideal of war, as war is idealized, promoted, and pursued. And the rest of the society is dragged into this willy-nilly. And so therefore, when we are talking about the heroes of a warrior culture in the traditional society, it might have been chiefs of tribes, heads of ethnic communities, and so on. In modern times, we may have changed the format, the looks, and the appearance, that it may not appear as a traditional society. But even within our modernity, we have incorporated the basic tenets of warrior cultures. Our chiefs are still commanders-in-chief. They are still our heroes. They are the ones who define our goals that may no longer be tribal goals, but we recoin and reterm and rename them as national goals, national objectives, national interests. And it's in the interest and for the purpose of these national interests that, once again, just like in traditional societies, people are dragged into wars. And so the warrior culture mentality is ever present in our present circumstance. It hasn't left us. It has simply changed its looks, the wrappings, the cover, which are means of deceiving a society into such a thinking. And the end result is that the traditional warrior culture has become a culture of war. We know that from the earlier periods, the term war was much more acceptable. We had presidents of war, we had secretaries of war, ministers of war, ministries of war, and so on. I think in the U.S. history, if I remember it correctly, not that I lived then, but remembering it through reading the history, that George Washington's first cabinet had a secretary of war. Now, with the passage of time, that term appeared to be not just archaic, but sort of, to use a modern jargon, politically incorrect. So it had to be corrected. And eventually it became, the Secretary of War became the Secretary of Defense. Not that its objectives changed, but to make it sound good, because the Secretary of War would have sounded, or at least it would have sounded paradoxical with our claim to democracy. So in many ways, the changes that occur in our modern society is a change of political correctness. It's a change of the evolution of the terminologies, whereas our behavior has not changed at all. We are still every bit a warrior culture, or a culture of war. We kill more. We kill more effectively. We destroy more. All the technologies that our science and our scientific community discover and develop and manufacture is first employed in a war effort. Because for one, there's not much accountability in that. Any accountability becomes subservient to the lofty ideals of our national goals. That is our religion. We can't question that. So the technology is employed, and since a lot of our technology, unfortunately, is also destructive by nature, our planes, our bombs, our bombers, our tanks, our guns. So the weapon manufacturers then play hand in glove with this effort. So the concept that I introduced, that we have only evolved technologically, but our mindset has remained in the warrior culture of the past. And perhaps it's because of that that we are much more dangerous now in the 21st century than our ancestors ever were. And the reason being this employment or application of the technology, that we have become much more ruthless. Those who inflict the pain and the suffering on others have distanced themselves by necessity as well as by the means of the technology, that they are not going to the battlefield to see bloodshed on the field, to see heads chopped off, to see the carnage that they cause. And so since they are distanced and they can simply push a button and end the lives of 20, 30, 40 or more people, therefore they become callous, they become indifferent, their senses and their sensibility, sense both in the logical sense as to whether they understand it or not, that departs, because the person is simply taking orders, and it's these orders that are implemented in the name of national defense, for example, in the name of destroying the enemies of democracy. And of course, the assumption is that we claim democracy to be ours. And if it's ours, it can't be theirs. And if they are resisting it, then they are the enemies of democracy in addition to being the enemies of America and, by extension, the enemies of humanity, and therefore their extermination, and I'm using the word deliberately, their extermination becomes the goal. And so, have we evolved? Back to the question. Have we evolved? I don't think so. If there's any evolution, it has to be a spiritual evolution. I'm not talking about ghosts and goblins. I'm talking about the spiritual dimension of our humanity, our innate sense of being, our consciousness, our sense of awareness. That is spiritual to me. It has nothing to do with any method of worship of any god in any form, in any temple. Here, the temple is the temple of your heart. And if you have opened the gates of your heart, where you have begun to worship the ideal divine source of power, then you have consciousness. If you have that consciousness, you would understand that it's possible only because you are alive. You are alive because you have life. And by life, I don't mean lifestyle. By life, I mean the spirit running through you. And if you appreciate that, if you appreciate you being alive, you ought to appreciate life in general. Life in other body forms. Life in animals. Life in plants in plants and vegetations. Life in general. Then, with that awareness, you would never attempt to take that life from any living being. With that mindset, the concept of enemy does not exist. Enemy is that which is opposing me, and the me you are defending is your ego. You have been insulted, perhaps, by a truth that you couldn't handle, that you couldn't face. So long as you're centered in your ego, so long as the me counts, any that opposes the me will be your enemy. I'm playing with words, of course, but in many other languages, just as in English, the word for the enemy contains the me, which then represents the ego. Dushman in Daryan Farsi, for example, is dushman, and man is the ego part of it. I will spare you the details of going through the etymology of other languages, but it's all in there. So why do we create the enemy? We create the enemy because we have not been able to see ourselves through a lens other than our egoistic entrapment. And if we could, then there is no enemy, because you could bring that enemy within. Don't see it outside. When you see a contradiction in the outer world and you see yourself aloof, above, and separate from it, you are not going to solve it. However, if you can bring it in, if you can bring it within yourself, if you can own it, if you can see your own shadow, you will see the light. Of course, the shadow has to be owned and tamed and controlled and gone beyond it. And so therefore, the within and without of the main stimuli that draws us into a defensive mode, that defense of the ego in the individual then sometimes becomes the defense of the ego in the collective. And it's the defense of the ego in the collective that becomes the warrior culture. That's what we were talking about as the heroes. Your hero is a representation and a manifestation of your ego self in the collective, operating within a society, tribal societies of the past as much as modern societies of our time. Yes, that is a different way of looking at the culture of war. Do our leaders understand this? Some do, but many don't. And even those who do are at the helm of this ocean liner that is not easy to steer in a direction away from that of which the collective ego defense is headed for. They are headed for a coalition, either with another big ocean liner, with another big ship, with another big cruiser, and at times, if there isn't any, yes, an iceberg would do, and we go down with it. So just as the iceberg can be deceiving, that the bulk of its weight and volume is below the water, except for the tip, our behavior is the same. The bulk of our egoistic attitude is below the surface. We bring things to the surface for public consumption, for public receptivity, and so that it can have a more receptive and acceptable terminology, that we can lure others into this and employ them in this war machine. And if we talk about this in the spiritual term, yes, it sounds good, but I don't know if that's effective, if that discourse is effective when we are trying to convince those who have the power and who are busy engaging us in more and more wars around the world that results not only in the killings of tens of thousands, but in the displacement of millions and millions of people, to such a point that in spite of everything we have achieved, the prowess of our technology and the claim to civility and the bragging of modernity, the problem becomes worse and worse, since today we have more displaced people than at any time in the human history. There are 65 million, think of that number, 65 million external refugees. That is larger than almost any European country's population. But let's not forget that there are a million more in most of these war-torn countries that are domestically displaced and do not qualify as refugees, and therefore they are not identified as such. If they can be identified, that 65 million figure will definitely exceed 100 million or so. So why is it happening? Why are we so indifferent? Because, as I said, the mindset is that of a warrior culture. We like our culture because we think it's a sense of our social, anthropological achievement of civility through the course of history that distinguishes us from those who are not, quote-unquote, cultured enough. Not by any measure of our humanity, not by any measure of our sense of sympathy, not by any measure of appreciating life in any form, but by prioritizing the value of life and claiming it first for ourselves and then to those close to us culturally, ethnically, and in every other way. And in this manner, we do create the other. And the other is none other but the enemy that we discussed earlier. So we are busy creating othernesses from amongst the common human family. And once we create them, we have to deal with them. And our dealing with the other is through the most violent form of interaction, war. Let's talk about some concrete terms here to see if the theoretical that I proposed really makes sense. Aside from the fact that we have changed the name of the Department of War to the Department of Defense, we have gone much further than that and much farther than that in creating a warrior culture, and has made that a norm for our society in general. And that is through militarization. And the militarization concept is that because the military needs to use the technology, the weapon manufacturers provide that. And so therefore the weapon manufacturers and the militarists are hand and glove involved in this. That which is produced, and I'm talking about weapons, bombs and bombers and planes and tanks, that which is produced had to be used, and if it's not used, there's going to be more unemployment. So then you have to create the need for the use of the weapons. And since weapons are not consumed for the betterment of life, for the improvement of life, they are meant to, by design, to destroy. So we create the need for the weapons by creating conflicts. And it's in the conflicts that wars are launched, regardless of how they are justified. Once that need is created, and those weapons are used, more weapons are needed. And so they have to be manufactured. And this is the definition of the military industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about. We are stuck with that too. So, the more weapons are used, the better it is for the business. So, on the one hand, obviously we use it for the military, our military. They deserve to have the best. On the other hand, we extend that, because if we have all the weapons, and most of the other countries, especially in the third world country where it's easy to start a conflict, if they don't have weapons, then we can take over some poor country, and that will be the end of a war. And the end of a war is not good for the weapon manufacturers. So we have to militarize the enemy too. So we give them weapons too. We give weapons to dictators. We export and sell weapons to many nations. And when necessary, we give weapons to their opposition too. We are in the market for selling weapons to anyone who can afford it, and to many who cannot afford it. And this way, what's good for General Motors is good for America. General Dynamics and the many other generals as corporations, and coincidentally the generals who wear the stars on their shoulders. Generals and generals. So the world conflicts are created primarily for this purpose. You might say I'm simplifying this. I'm not simplifying them to take the underlying issues that result in the conflict, but I'm simplifying the concepts so that we can understand them better. So this simplification is not oversimplification, so to say. Rather, the increasing of its comprehensibility I apologize for being a little too wordy, but the idea is to be specific in it. Yes, I'm trying to get the point across. So I'm simple there. But I'm not simplifying the concept because someone would claim, well, these issues are too complicated. They are not, because the bottom line is that at one level or another, it has to do with guns and gun makers and soldiers and soldiering. Doesn't matter what label you put on them. National defense, national interest, foreign conflicts, wars, it's all violence geared toward taking life, because you can't take life voluntarily unless it's taken by force. And that's where the term force comes in. Air Force. We force others into submission because they dare to differ. Do we still have the right to claim to be democratic? Is it any sin for others to think different, to feel different, and to come up with different solutions for their different problems? Or must they comply with ours? We define what their problems are. We define what their solutions are. We decide for them how to think of a solution for their problems. Therefore, we introduce our ideologies as solutions to our problems as much as we see that as a solution to their problems. Throughout the Cold War, it was the ideas of the Scottish Adam Smith and the German Karl Marx, both Europeans, who tried to make the rest of the world adhere to their principles of finding economic solutions to their social ills. So millions and millions of soldiers lined up to fight for either Das Kapital or for capitalism. Adam Smith's and Karl Marx's. It was nothing but capital. And in its final manifestation, capitalism and communism, there was no communism. That too was state capitalism, state-controlled capitalism, centralized economies with the 5-year plans, and all the rest was nothing but capitalism. All they denied was private ownership. And the private ownership wasn't really transferred to the public, rather kept as the monopoly of the party, the Communist Party. Because now, instead of an individual or a corporation, a Communist Party claimed to have the right to rule in the name of the people and to distribute in the name of the people and to be the protector of the people. Therefore, neither as an economic system nor as a political philosophy, those who claimed communism really believed in it. And when I say believed in it, I'm talking about in the practical sense as they interacted with the citizens of their countries. They deprived more than any other, because that was a systemic deprivation in the name of establishing a system of distributive economics. The emphasis was on distribution rather than on producing. Not that the situation was any better under capitalism. We see that now when the competition between the two systems of capitalism, private enterprise and state capitalism, is over, we see the miseries of the private capital ownership, where the 1% rules over the 99%. And the deprivations continue, except that we are made to think of these deprivations as the norm, as the acceptable. And no one asked the question, how is it possible that, according to a recent report, we heard that $6.5 trillion are unaccounted for? Let me repeat that number again, $6.5 trillion. These are from the year 2015 alone, in 1 year, that the army lost or didn't keep required data, which the government asked for. So this is not hearsay. So how is it that $6.5 trillion are unaccounted for, and not in a third world country where we can blame it on corruption and mismanagement, but we are talking about the United States of America? With that amount of money having disappeared, we have people who sleep on sidewalks. That shocks some of the new immigrants. Is this the America we came to? We see millions of our children who go hungry to bed, and we expect them to wake up in the morning and be ready to study and to learn and to improve and to evolve. Yes, our deprivations are there. They don't make the 6 o'clock news. They are not on the radar of those who are responsible, because their priorities are different. Their priorities are how to give millions and millions to foreign governments who are equally suppressive of their population. A shocking video that I saw just yesterday. It's one of Israeli soldiers using attack dogs on Palestinian children. Attack dogs on Palestinian children, not just to kill them, but to instill in them the fear that survival can never be taken for granted, that life can be snapped from them at any time. So they die many times over and over. Some of you may find the video on the social media. This is done by a government that has the support of every American population, president and politician. the support of every American presidential candidate, present and past, the support of every American leader, because they claim to be defending the Middle East's only democracy, whereas in reality, it's the world's only remaining apartheid regime. Where is our humanity? Why do we have to look the other way? The video I saw was not an exception. I have seen many. I'm sure many of you have too. So why is there this unconditional support for one state? In the context we are discussing, it's because that state, in one way or another, contributes to virtually every conflict in the Middle East. The conflict in Syria, for example. Do we want to remove Assad's regime in Damascus? The Russians, perhaps the Iranians, think that if they do, it will weaken Syria vis-a-vis Israel. So they have to support it. And they are supporting a dictator who has been responsible, perhaps not single-handedly, but in uncalled for collaboration with oppositions to whom civil rights and liberties were denied. They are responsible for the killing of now nearly 500,000 Syrians. Their own citizens that are barrel bombed. Their own citizens who go to hospitals and clinics, and the frequency of the bombing of medical facilities now amounts to about 1 every 17 hours. That in every 17 hours, somewhere in Syria, in the war zone, in Aleppo, and perhaps Damascus and elsewhere, a hospital, a medical clinic, a medical facility is bombed to smithereens to kill not those who come to be healed, those who are coming to survive, but to kill also those who had taken the Hippocratic oath to protect the life of others. And yes, it's in this conflict, again, like I said, that one way or another, the presence of Israel and the United States' unconditional support for it contributes to that. We had to reduce the strength of Iraq because it was an enemy of Israel, because Iraq supported the Palestinians and the Palestinians were terrorists, and therefore it justified our invasion. And so the people of the Middle East suffer partly because our ego at the collective level is involved. Partly it's because our prejudice, where the Judeo-Christian concept is the acceptable, the Islamic, the non-acceptable. Partly because racially, as the white man's burden, as the manifest destiny, we take charge. In Israel, it's not so much the European state, but from the racial perspective, it's the white Western European Jews that dominate the political scene. And the other Jews, the Sephardics and the rest, are, if not subservient, at least not prominent in the government. So race is an important element in this conflict. So, all in all, these wars are racial, they are religious, they are ideological, they are political, and yes, they are economic as well. And all the dimensions and the criteria and the typology I defined amounts to nothing but the self and the ego versus the other. And therefore, a warrior culture is in full swing without any evolutionary improvement to enable us to claim civility in the 21st century, as though we may have graduated to a higher level. Not so. The militarization continues. We have the militarization, we talked about the militarization of our own military as well as those of the other countries. We talked about the militarization of the conflict zones by selling weapons to rebels and opposition groups and ethnic minorities and religious minorities. And we have also militarized our police. And the incident that I once saw in Holland, in Amsterdam, a few years back with my wife, there was a problem in a bank where we went to exchange some money. They called the police. So we stepped out of the bank. We saw a small Volkswagen car that pulled in the distance over to the side. And that was supposed to be the police car because it had a blue light on top. 2 police officers came out of that. They were wearing warm sweaters, olive color, with pants. But there were no guns drawn. There were no weapons. They didn't have shields. They didn't look like soldiers. They simply looked different from the civilians by being dressed in olive color uniform. They came to the bank and they talked to the manager. And they were very discreet and very polite and went over to the man who had some problem, perhaps a threat of violence or some such a thing that necessitated the calling of the police. They took him aside, had a conversation with him for 10-15 minutes or so. And after that, they shook his hand and apologized for the interruption. The man went back and stood in line. The police went. They sat in their car and they went about their business. This was an interaction in an incident in which the police in Holland were involved. Now imagine that possibility in America. Our police are militarized. They think militarily in terms of the weapons that they carry, the trainings that they have. That is a problem. We could discuss this a little further, and we will in this next episode. the militarization of the police, and perhaps also the gender equality war that has been dragged into, and we are now militarizing the women. Don't get me wrong. I am for gender equality in the sense of their legal standing before the law, or in terms of establishing a system of social harmony where people who are identified differently in terms of their gender can still be respected. And that would be part of our next discussion. So for this short episode, I bid you farewell. Have a nice day.